Peter Middleton Lovett.
And when and where were you born, Peter?
I was born in Preston, I was born in a place called Grimsby, but that's just outside Preston. You're part of Preston. And then we lived in Longreach for a couple of months, I think. My father used to cycle into Preston. And then we moved into Miller Road, then I forget the other one, then we moved to Homeslack, which was a council estate. Yeah.
So how old are you now?
98.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and friends for when you were growing up and stuff like that? Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and when you were growing up?
When I was growing up?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was brought up a strict Catholic. We were a very strong Catholic family. My grandfather, who lived in Preston, was an organist. He played with the Halley Orchestra, played the piano. He played for the secretary to the ambassador of Spain once, and he was presented with a sword stick, a gold sword stick, which my son's got now. And I went to a nuns' school to start with, Catholic school, where the nuns wore all black and hooded and all long canes to them. And I failed my 11 plus.
Right.
Which was a bit of a letdown for my father, because my father had been brought up by Jesuits. He'd been educated by the Jesuits, and he said that they were the best for teaching. But I went to St. Ignatius Central School, and then I got a job in a coal, at 14, you left school at 14 then, and I got a job in a coal office as a clerk at the weighing out the coal. The trouble was, I was more interested in the lorries, and they had one Morris commercial lorry with a long bonnet, and the others were forward controlled, and they also had 4 horses carts.
Oh.
And I used to go out and, well, not play with the horses, but I was very fond of them. And when possible, I'd go out with the last load. We used to shovel anthracite to a place called Horton Towers, and I'd go out with the lorry when I'd finished work on the last. When we got to Horton Towers gate, the driver would teach me how to drive this, and I'd drive it up and then reverse it, and that was it. And that's where I learnt to drive, basically. And then I was wanting to join the army, but my mother was born in India,
right,
with 4 sisters who still live in Preston, or who used to live in Preston. They're now, their children do. And I wanted to join the army at 14, but my grandfather, who was a retired battery sergeant major, told my mother not to let me go in. It wasn't suitable for me. I got rheumatic fever when I was about 10, I think, or 11. I was in bed for a year at home with heart trouble and and all those things. And I put my age up in. I got myself sacked from the coal office. The bloke, Mr. Worden, who drove an SS Jaguar, and he said to me, "I know what you're trying." I kept making mistakes on the things. And he said, "I know what you're trying to do." He said, "If you want me to," he said, "I'll sack you," because it was a reserved occupation.
Right.
So I said, "Well, I do want to join the army." So anyway, so he gave me a week's notice. My mother went spare, she did. But I had to put my age up 6 months to get in. So I went to see a girlfriend up in Fulwood, whose father was a retired major in the army who was on the selection boards. And I went to see him about it. And he said, "Well, if you come down to the recruiting office, and you'll find about 4 or 5 officers there." When I went down there were 5 officers. And he said, "You just get your date right." And he said, "And I won't ask you anything." So I gave him my name, address, date of birth, and he said, right, sign the paper. And I was called up on I was called up on my birthday.
Right.
But I was 18. No, let me see how much we've got. I was born in 1924, and I joined in 42, so I was 18 then. But I was still ahead of my time.
What motivated you to join the army? What motivated you to join the army?
I put in to join the border regiment, and I went up to Carlisle. I joined the border regiment. I went into Carlisle and became part of the General Service Corps. And then I was put into the border regiment with the border. We bought a side cap, the green badge. But before I'd had the badge in for longer than 5 weeks, they changed me to the King's Regiment. And then we marched out with bands playing, and we went down to Felixstowe. And we started all round the coast. We went from Felixstowe, we went to Renfrewshire, we went to Irvine. The golf course at St Anne's up there. The golf house was made into a big naffy, and we were in nissen huts all in the sand dunes, created havoc with their holes. And then we were transferred because we were transferred to the 8th Irish Battalion. That was the Liverpool Irish. I went up before the CO and asked if I could transfer to the 10th, which was the 10th Scottish Battalion, because my father was in that one. And he said the 10th Battalion don't exist. He said it's now one of the Highland Regiment they transferred it to. So I stayed in there. And with becoming Liverpool Irish, I went into we became number 7 beach group.
Right.
And we started doing training for beach landings, and we eventually came down to Bournemouth here, and then got on lorries to Poole, got into landing craft, and they were wooden landing craft.
Wow.
They weren't metal.
Right.
And the pilots, the blokes driving them, were Army Service Corps. They weren't Navy. And of course these things broke down sometimes. Right. But as we came out of Poole Harbour, we came down and did an assault landing on Studland Bay. And we did that for quite a time. We got dry landings to start with, but then the chaps who were driving the landing craft realised that if they got grounded, they had to wait for high tide to come in to float them off, and they missed coming back to Poole for their cups of tea or their dinner. So we did all that training. And we did other training, which is in the thing I gave you. And then we went to Chandler's Ford in the end, which is just outside Southampton. And it was there was a pub there, which the pub is still there. But there were hardly any houses about. It was all trees, and we were in a tented camp. And the Canadians were up there as well. And then one day they told us today was the day we got into lorries. We went down to, I think it was Portsmouth or Southampton, and got onto landing craft. And I was on a landing craft, and one of these LCILs, that's one with the ramps that go down the side. And I've since found out through one of the nerds on there that my landing craft, I've got the number somewhere, it was just one or the other. But I know we landed at Grayson on Juno Beach.
What was your job to do on the day, Peter?
Sorry?
What was your job to do on the day when you landed on Juno Beach? What was...
Oh, the job of the land, if you watch the newsreels, you'll see men with with helmets with a white band around the helmet, 2 inches. They were always beach group men.
Yeah.
And the beach group men were the only people allowed to remain on the beach. And it was our job. I went in with second wave assault. The rest of the battalion came in on the ship, and then transferred apparently to landing craft, came in, they got a hammering down the beach. Juno Beach was about 5 miles long, so we didn't see them coming in. But when I landed, there were dead soldiers in the water where you pushed the dead bodies to one side as you were waist deep in the water, and they were dead on the beaches. Later we had to dig out and get their identity, disc from and everything. And it was our job to supervise clearance of landing craft as they came in with reinforcements and get them off the beach, because the job with the assault troops was to hit the beach and then to get in. It wasn't their job to tidy up the beach or to clear the beach. They had to get in. And of course, when we got down, there was still a couple of pillboxes apparently that were still occupied. There were landing craft with dead bodies in them that had landed opposite the pillboxes, and they'd just been cut down before they could get out of the landing craft. The ramp went down and the machine guns opened up. And there must have been about three blokes got out if necessary. I think something like that. But then, and then we had the military police going along the beach, finding blokes who'd volunteered to help us, because as reinforcements came in, infantry blokes would leave them and wander along and start helping us on the beach, doing things. And they'd arrest them and send them back out there. And we had the tanks. On our beach, the Canadians got about 5 miles in, but the tanks couldn't bloody well catch up with them.
Right.
Or they hadn't landed properly. And when they did get in eventually, but they were on that string. And then 5 weeks later, they told us that the beach group was packing up. We were no longer needed for things because things had progressed a lot. They were getting troops in other ways. And you were told you could go to any regiment you wanted to. And myself and apparently about another 30 blokes volunteered for paratroops. And then 2 days later, I was interviewed in a ditch by a paratroop sergeant.
Right.
He came down and interviewed us and talked to us. And then 2 days later, 2 3-tonners came down. We were just called out by name. You got on the trucks and off you went. And I found myself up in a place in the Bois de Bavon, the wood at Bavon, at a place called the Bungalow.
Right.
And Chateau Saint-Com. And just 2 or 3 of us apparently got off at the bungalow, and I was told, you're with A Company. And as we went through, there were 3 graves in the garden of the thing. But then somebody said, you see that slit trench down there? There's a Lance Corporal down there. You take over the Bren gun, you're down there.
Well,
so I went down there, and there's a Lance Corporal, and he said, hello. So I said, I've got to come with you. So I said, oh, thank God for that. So then I took over the Bren gun, and they gave me a 45 pistol as well. And I was Bren gunner. And we did a couple of patrols into the woods over the next few weeks. We did a standing patrol. I've since been in touch with blokes who've been over there.
Right.
I mentioned a ditch that we got over, and they told me that the ditch is still there. I told them where we had a standing patrol, and they said they found the joint in the track path, but they couldn't find any trace of any trenches. But it was one person in each hole, and you had a piece of string to your finger, and that went all into the centre where the sergeant was. And if you saw anybody, you had to pull your string. And then when we came back one day, we came back to a barn where there was a barn located there, and we were having some breakfast. And you just heard a swoosh bang, and I was lifted up and I thrown about 6 feet, 7 feet, and I finished up upside down in a slit trench.
Wow.
And all I remember hearing was blokes shouting, medics, medics. And they dragged me out, and next thing I was on the jeep. And I finished up, and I don't remember much until I woke up in a bed in a hospital.
Right.
And that was in Bayeux. It was in a big marquee. And I remember coming round as a doctor came round asking the sisters what it was. And like me, I was feeling around and I felt everything. But I'd got blast and gravel in my face and everything done. But the sister said to the doctor, it's a concussion. And I said, I want to get back. And he told me in gentlemanly language, you do as you're fucking well told. And he said to the sister, see what he's like in the morning, then send him. In the morning, I was all right. And I was put into a transit camp just across the road.
Yeah.
I had to get my gear and to go across there. And I met at the gate with 2 military police, and he said, who are you? I said, I'm 9 para. So he said, you're with the 8 tents down there. And there were lots of tents over there.
Mm-hmm.
And I went wandering down, and there were some blokes in there, and they were paras and commandos who'd been injured. And I'd stayed there only for 2 days and said, I'm going to get back, and look, I'm wasting time here. And so with 2 other blokes, we went to the gate. We were stopped by the military police again. And they said, there's a lorry going up past your way. In about an hour, so you wait here. And then we just got on this lorry. I was back at the bungalow, and the company commander saw me and said, I thought we'd seen the last of you. I said, no fear, I won't miss this. And that was that. And then, of course, we started off to travel into Normandy. We started off in advance. But it was by some misfortune or fortune, I found myself in the front lead of the front section with a Bren gun. And but we were told where to expect machine guns and everything, because the sniper had been out beforehand. He'd been out for days and during the weeks, and he had a little card that told him where. When we got there was nobody there, and we eventually crossed over a plank across a ditch or running water, and joined a railway line where we met up with guys in Dodger Lane. And that's where I met the first Germans, because
Right.
the routine was, if you're on patrol and you went down, if you're on patrol, if you saw German patrol and they saw you stopped, they turned round, you turned round and went up. But this time there was no turning round.
Yeah.
And that's where I had my first using of the Bren gun.
Mm-hmm.
And we settled at the crossroads. We got mortared the following morning. And I was up on the one bank. There was an embankment. Next morning they were told, you go up the bank and watch the orchard. The others blokes were surrounded it. It was a crossroads. And I found myself next to a bloke who lived 400 yards from me.
Wow.
And I never even knew that he was in the army.
Right.
His mother and father ran a fish and chip shop. There were 2 brothers,
Mm-hmm.
Lawrence Bellamy they were, and I forget the other one. But after that, I never saw him until we came back to England. When we finished our stint in Normandy, I don't remember where it was, but we went up to Pont-l'Evêque. We had quite a bit of fighting around. We came back to Bulford Camp. We went into a modern barracks there. I was immediately sent up to Ringway to do my jumps with this other bloke, but this other bloke didn't come with me. apparently as soon as his mother found he'd volunteered for the paratroops, she told him that he wasn't allowed to and wrote to his CO.
Right.
And they sent him straight back to Normandy to an infantry unit. Never heard from him or his brother again. And I did my jumps, came back, then was sent on leave to Preston, greeted by my father. Where were you wounded? And all this and that and the other. And I had my leave, then went back to the battalion, which had strength. But when I joined the battalion first in the bungalow, I hadn't realised it at the time, but the battalion strength was 189 out of 900.
Right.
And so when we got there as reinforcements, we were welcomed there. Although only the King's Regiment reinforcements were brought back to England. Other blokes with volunteers were sent back to infantry units. And then we went to the Ardennes on Christmas Day on the backs of lorries. We travelled right across France, Belgium and Holland. We stopped at night one night in a monastery somewhere where the monks were still there with their habits and just boots with no socks on. And they were working in the fields. But we stayed there the night. One bloke shot himself in the foot by mistake because he was cleaning a pistol and he hadn't emptied it, which made us all jumpy. But we got to a long ridge. We took over from the Welsh Fusiliers, and then we went to a place called Bandé, where we found all the women and children. We couldn't find the men. Then we found them. They were all found in a barn. They'd all been machine gunned and killed in a barn.
Right.
So we had a funeral part. When I went to the War Museum to get photographs, to see if they had any photographs, there were photographs of the battalion on parade, just parading through this at Bandé, going to the church parade.
When you were going into Juno Beach, Peter, when you first went in on the landing craft to Juno Beach, can you tell us what you saw as you were going in?
Yeah. We were kept down below decks.
Right.
We were at the Hard somewhere. I think it was Portsmouth. But we were at the Hard. And we were on it for about 3 days.
Right.
And then they said, we're moving out. And we moved out. It was choppy. And then we started moving off somewhere. And we were still kept down below. But I didn't know it at the time. There were Winnipeg rifles in the rear part. We were all in the front part of this thing. And then suddenly they said, you can go up on deck and get ready. So we went up on deck and there was gunfire. You could see fires burning and everything. And we had to crouch down the side of this. We came in, we were about a mile away from the beach then. And the landing craft came in right up onto the beach. So it must have been, I've worked out really, it must have been high tide.
Right.
Because the ramps went down, we had to go down the water. And the water was up to here on this, wicked. But we'd done it at Studland.
Right.
And as I said, there were dead bodies around. And as soon as the bloke ashore, I think the bloke behind me came in nearly dry because I must have been making such a weight trying to get through the bloody water. But then we got into the sand dunes, and if you've ever been with wet battle dress with sand in your things and everything. But then there was some shooting. We had to go into Graysomer to clear a house, but I wasn't involved in that one. My section wasn't. And the company commander got a military cross for clearing a pillbox. Apparently he went round and put a grenade through it. He got that. That was Major Morrison was there. And just how it went on from there. There was chaos on the beaches because landing craft were landing all over the place. Although they were told, we landed on the spot on the correct place we were supposed to land. How we did it, I don't know. But I think I was on Nan Green or Nan Red and right by there. But we got off, but the rest came on and they got hammered apparently. I don't remember getting a meal for about a fortnight,
Well,
because we were living on packed rations. And when the LSTs came in, the landing ship tanks, they had big doors and they let around, and the tank, but they were all American ships, and it was always allocated, volunteered, one or two of us. You had to run on while the tanks were all being discharged, ask them if they had any rations. Sometimes they gave you a pack of rations, which was a box of rations, and then you rushed off and gave it. And I've always remembered one case when one bloke went on and he took too long. And as was the practice, as the last vehicle went off, the land craft started to come out and the ramp started to come up. Because typical Americans, they weren't hanging around. And I always remembered seeing him, he had to jump off the ramp into the water, which was deep. And of course, got 2 or 3 blokes ran in. They weren't after him, they were after the bloody rations. But he got ashore all right. But, and we lived on rations. And we lived in the sand dunes. We did get shelled, we got machine gunned once by a plane. I don't remember anything else on that. And we were there from the 6th of June until we left on, I think it was the 23rd of July, to go to Paris.
Could you tell us about your most frightening experience?
The frightening?
What was the most frightening thing you did during the whole war?
I don't know, because the funny thing was, when you're coming in on the landing craft, you could see all the stuff flying around and the noise. But all you knew was what you had to do. But I knew that once I got off this bloody thing, I'd got my feet on the ground, I was as good as anybody. And I also had this idea I couldn't let myself get killed because my mother would kill me when I went home. she was the Tartar at home.
Yeah.
But I was so lucky. Luck struck me everywhere. Look, within 20 minutes of being on the beach, I never said a prayer in my life. I became an atheist. Because some blokes did pray, they were getting shot. Germans were saying, German Catholics were praying, or Protestants were praying, they were getting shot and killed. And religion had no fit in it. It was a case of luck first and good training afterwards. And I did 32 jumps altogether, only one operational jump. I had one jump with an inverted canopy, which meant the canopy was inside out. But luckily it was an exercise with a tannoy down below, and I was number 5 in the stick.
Right.
And I remember a vague voice coming up to me saying, "Number 5, don't pull on your lift webs, just stop the gun." And you were swinging, coming down, and I could see the ground, and I thought I was going to be nice, but as I came down, of course, I swung up and then banged up, and I bounced on the ground. But I no sooner come round and a jeep came up with an officer, a sergeant, and a driver. The sergeant immediately grabbed hold of me, quick release. I'd done the quick release, you just twitched and smacked and your harness fell off. The officer immediately went to the parachute and started, we had a clipboard, and he was taking a number. And I found out a week later that one of the WAF packers was returned to unit.
Right.
It was a careless. I thought I'd made a bad exit to start with, but apparently she packed it inside out. But I was just dragged off the ground. Can you stand? Yes, I'm all right. Onto the jig, back to the hangar, another parachute, and before I knew it, you had your chute was put on a stand. You went and put it on, tightened up this, that, and the other. I was taken out on the jeep. There was another stick getting in, and the last bloke was saying, "Right, you're off. You're going in the next stick." I joined on. I was number 1, And so I went up again and came round. It was called a confidence jump.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I remember that when we came back from Bulford, we did another balloon jump. But there were jumps that we'd done. I'd already been to Ringway. But I remember that one of the blokes in there, he'd gone up in the cage, and he'd apparently unhooked himself, unbeknown to anybody. And as it was ready, he just went straight out, and he was killed. And I found out later that his girlfriend had gone off and married somebody else while he was in Normandy. And that got me up. I was also warned off one of the Naffy girls.
Right.
She was a nice looking girl. And the reason I was warned off was because her boyfriend had been killed in Normandy.
Right.
She'd been engaged to a bloke, so there was a terrific protection around blokes, girlfriends and things like that. And they did all that. And so it went on. Varsity came up, we did the daytime drop-in of Varsity, which I think they got nearly 180 gliders were shot down, which I was so glad that I was parachute. But even so, the Germans had anticipated an airborne landing, so they pulled all their anti-aircraft guns to behind what we call the Schneppenberg feature, which was the high hills. And of course, when all the planes went over, we all piled out. My plane had smoke coming from an engine, but we all piled out, and I wasn't looking where I was going. I was too busy watching. And when you're high up, you can't hear any guns, but as you were coming down, you could hear the guns, and the machine guns firing and anti-aircraft guns firing. And I didn't know it, but I was drifting back, and I landed in trees. Right. Now, normally when you land in trees, you either keep your legs together or you cross your legs to save the crown jewels and everything. But luckily it was very edge of the DZ, and I just came straight through the trees and crash right through. And of course, another precaution, you see, a silly thing. I was afraid of being taken on the ground before I could get to my gun.
Right.
And so I'd got a pistol, I'd got a Bren gun at that time. And I'd cocked my pistol, put the hammer down, very gentle, put it in my smock. And so as soon as I landed on the ground, I had the gun out just in case to see it. But there was one of my mates who'd been hit in the hand with a machine gun bullet. And he was called, they called him Smokey, but he was blue. He was carrying blue smoke capsules, and they went on to somebody else. But when you landed, you had to look for blue smoke, and I could see blue smoke in that corner, green smoke over there, and that's where your company was. And he'd been hit in the hand, and he was disabled. The medics got him later, but when they got to the first aid post, he'd been hit 5 times, but they were all bullet burns.
Right.
And they'd gone through his trousers, through his equipment, and it just hadn't hit once, and one of the machine guns had hit him. But just pure luck when it caught him in the hand. But he was the luckiest bloke alive. He could have been hit 5 times.
Did you lose anyone close to you, Peter? Did you lose any good friends?
It's hard to say this because I never had friends. I was always an individual. I knew blokes. I've forgotten a lot of their names. I remember the blokes in the Liverpool Irish, some of them. And I remember the names of the para blokes. But I never had any really close friends. I never got close friends to anybody because at the time I didn't want to be close friends with anybody. And luck stayed with me. I was lucky. I was lucky in Palestine because we went to Palestine, and there were quite a few of our blokes were killed in Palestine by the Irgun. And then when I came out, I went into the Blackpool police, and God, I had to provide a list of everything from which school I'd gone to. And if there was a time when I hadn't been working or something, somebody had to sign it to say that I hadn't been in trouble. And I joined the Blackpool police. But you see, in those days, if you're a policeman out, that you had a beat, you had a 1 hour beat, and it was going to such an extent that when you were in the police, the sergeant looked at his watch and say, "Oh, he's on number 5 beat at such a time, so he'd be outside somebody's front door."
Yeah.
And they knew all about that. But it was funny because I'd only been in the police 2 weeks when I came across a fire engine outside the house, and they called me over. They said, "Got some trouble here for you." So I said, "Oh, okay." So they said, this is the kitchen. I went round to the kitchen, and he said, "Can you get in through the window? Because we don't want to move the door." So I got in there, and it was all black and burnt. And in the corner, he said, "We found him there." And there was a kid there.
Oh, no.
And, there was a bloke there. So they said, "Well, what are we going to do with him?" I said, "Well, you better take him away then." So they said, "Okay, to take him." So I said, "Yeah." So, of course, away he went. And then I went out and I tackled the bloke who was on the stretcher. And I said, how are you feeling? What's your name? I said, "What's your mate's name?" So he said, "How is my mate?" I said, "Oh, I don't want to talk to him at the moment." So he gave me his name, and he was a 17-year-old kid.
Right.
And they'd been laying a rubber floor. Mm-hmm. Somehow a spark had come, and the whole place had got on fire. He'd gone out of the window, but the kid had tried to get out the door, but he couldn't open the door because it was. And then when the sergeant came up and he said, "Oh, you know what's going on?" So I said, "Oh, there's been a fire in here." So he saw the blokes carrying his dog. He said, "What's that?" So I said, "That's the body of a kid that was in there working with him." So he said, "How did you know he was dead? You're supposed to get a doctor down." I said, "I've seen enough dead bodies in my time." I said he was dead. So he said, "Oh, I hope." And I said, "I've got his name and address off the other bloke, but the other bloke doesn't know he's dead yet." So he said, "Right, you see, I'll give you a job now." And his name was Whittaker, Sergeant Whittaker, and we called him Ticker because everybody was Ticker Wicker, White was Snowy and all that sort of Ticker Whittaker. And he was a hard bugger, he was, but what a change. We went to this house and we had to tell his mother, his father was dead, and we had to tell his mother that his son was dead. And I've never seen a change in this sergeant. He was so, "Come on, Mum, sit down. Let's make a cup of tea for you, you know." And then he had to tell her that her son was dead. Of course, that broke things up. Then, of course, in those days, any neighbours went, "Well, yeah, something next door." So sent me next door to bring the woman around. I said, "What's happened?" I said, "His son was dead." And then she stayed with him. But anyway, I had a couple of fights because in those days you held your own.
Yeah.
And if a pub had to come out and you got into a fight, you put a bloke down. Well, I did anyway. And you didn't arrest him. You said to his mates, "Look, this is my patch. Take him home, get him home."
Oh, God, right.
And they took him home. And then when you were on, you were either Mr. Lovett, or then it was your patch, and you weren't going to play around.
What was it like, Peter, when you first got home? What was it like transitioning from coming home from being in the army and seeing what you saw to when you come back?
Terrible. That's why I went back. I went back for another 5 years in the 2nd Para Battalion.
Right.
I re-enlisted, went out to Cyprus and Palestine. But by that time, I'd married a girl in England. She'd been in the army. She was in the ATS. I met her in Aldershot. And she told me which clubs to go to in Nicosia, in Cyprus.
Yeah.
And every time I watched the film Lawrence of Arabia, where they got the Citadel, which was the headquarters, she used to work in there.
Right.
But the only place I ever got to that she got to was in Cairo. I never got to Cairo because I was in the canal zone all the time when we got thrown out. And anyway, I finished up a sergeant and PRI. So I made up my mind I wasn't going to be in a rifle company. And when I first joined, I was in Bren gun carriers. And I went to Germany, in Hanover. I went to Bren gun carriers, then jeeps. Then I got into a bit of trouble. Got put in the guard room for a fortnight, in the town guard room. And while I was in there, the transport officer came around and I said, when I come out, can I join the transport? 3 tons. Yes, all right. When I got there, half the blokes there had been in the nickels.
Right.
And we did all that all right. And then I became the CO's driver when we came back to England. And he lived in a house in, I forgot where that was now. But it went on from there. And then I went to PRI Corporal. And then PRI, so we went to Lakenheath, one detachment. And I went with the PRI sergeant. We were at Lakenheath and we were guarding the American bombers. And they'd never had the paras down there before. And apparently the word was at night time you never went near the aircraft because the army were guarding it. But they had a big do down one night in the mess. An American pilot and somebody else was going, come over and have a look at the planes. I'll show you my plane. Because he was challenged by a sentry and shot. Because Paul 2 goes there and it's all right, halt or I fire. And bang, he went.
Whoa, so he shot him?
He shot him and killed him, isn't it?
God.
But the other bloke was, and straight up, he was an Englishman. He'd just been invited for the evening, you know. There was a hell of an outcry, but they were cleared. They'd never had the paras down there before guarding. From then on, nobody went near the bloody place at night and kept on. And we did that all right. And that was why, I don't know if you remember in Northern Ireland, Paris, I think it was Bloody Friday. After the shooting there were no demonstrations for about a fortnight after that. Nobody dared until they started feeling their way around. But I wouldn't have liked to have gone to Northern Ireland. It was a bit like Palestine at the time. You couldn't tell a good one from a bad one. And that was that. So that's how it all finished up, really.
What I was going to say, Peter, I've finished my questions, but this interview has been amazing, right? Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the war or about your life or anything you'd like to say before I finish on the camera? I mean, the stories about Juno Beach are amazing.
I don't think there was really in Germany. Well, the only thing is, at one stage in Germany, we'd fought the SS a few times, Leibstandarte and Das Reich in Normandy. When we went over the Rhine, we had a few troubles ahead, but the worst, we once came up against an officer training unit, and the kids were about 15, 16 years old, right? And they were terrible to fight because you had to kill them. There was no hesitation. They would. And that was the stiffest part. Another time we got put onto tanks, and I think it was the Guards Armour, Cromwell's, I think. And we were told we had to get ahead to a place called Wismar. And we moved on, we were on the tanks, the battalion got a commendation from the tanks for working in cooperation with them, because as soon as they ran into trouble, our blokes were off and doing the job. But we got to Wismar, and I actually met the Russians, and I met them at a garden gate, and they were at a gate and we were on the gate, and they were dirty, filthy buggers, they were. But they weren't Russians. They were either Georgians or they were some other part of the USSR. Mm-hmm. And you can tell how bad they were. That I don't remember a para going with any of the women there.
Right, right.
And they had these quilted coats on. Some of the blokes hadn't got weapons even. There were masses of them. They had to pick up weapons. It was how that they fought. They were terrible people to fight, because they just hadn't got the weapons, but they just went on, picked up weapons and just overwhelmed whoever was there. But anyway, the trouble then happened for a minute for 2 days, because they'd been told they had to go 50 miles further on, and we'd stopped them, and we didn't know why, but we found out later that if they'd got down, they'd have got into Denmark. Yeah. Denmark would have been a satellite then as well. So we were lucky there. But then we had to withdraw. There had to be a no man's land in between. And the Germans had a medieval way of farming. All the farm buildings were in the middle, and the farmland went out.
Right.
But the Germans, these Russians, used to go into Wismar, and they'd kidnap women and rape them, maybe kill them, took them back to their land. So consequently, as night was coming on, quite a few girls used to slip across and come into our area.
To stay safe.
And for to be safe.
Yeah.
And I know there were, I'll tell you that later.
Yeah.
And that was that. And then when we withdrew from there, we came back to England. But there was one farm when we were moving to, there was a big factory with a gate, and we were all walking. And there was a German at the gate handing boxes out to soldiers. Mm-hmm. And I took them up. When I opened it, it was a Mauser,
right,
all greased up. And
right.
It was apparently fat. So I had this greased up Mauser, I had a Luger, I had another one, then I had 3.22 rifles. And I brought them all back to England with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we just went straight through customs. And I brought them home, left them all with my father. When I came back from Palestine, I wanted to see them because I knew I loved guns and everything. Yeah. And I've still got my fighting knife. But my father had handed everything into the police. He'd got a guilty feeling. And the war, he'd been wounded in the First World War.
Your dad?
And yeah, he was wounded with shrapnel.
Right.
And he was in Liverpool Scottish on the Somme. And I've got his records. I found out where he was wounded and everything.
So your dad was on the Somme and you were at DD? That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to transfer to the 10th, to the Liverpool Scottish. But you see, I found out for the Liverpool Scottish, the London Scottish, and I found out since then the Irish Guards all wear the cap badge over the right eye.
Right.
And the reason we did was because when it was formed in, I think, 1910 or something, the battalion, it accommodated the Irish immigrants that had come over from Southern Ireland as navvies to work on the canals and everything in India. And they were all Catholics, and they were, consequently, by wearing the badge over the right eye, we were cocking a snoop at the crown because everybody else had it on the left.
Okay.
And I wrote to the Irish Guards, to the adjutant, asked him why their pipers wore the badge over the right eye. And he said, I haven't got a clue, most likely because they could aim the rifle better without the carbine going. And that was a load of flannel because it was back to the religious thing.
Did you ever well, did you ever take any prisoners when you were anywhere in Germany?
Sorry?
Did you ever take any prisoners? Did you
Oh,
ever take
yeah.
any German prisoners?
When I was on the beach, I saw my first Germans on the beach.
Right.
And they were a gang of prisoners brought in, but they were a mixture of Russian type people and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then some Russian soldiers came in there, some German soldiers came in as prisoners, and they were a bugger, they were. But we only had a ring of damage wire on the beach, and they were in the middle of it, sat there, and just had a sentry standing by.
Mm-hmm.
And actually they didn't want to escape then. They'd use it, they would. And they were just all shoved onto a landing craft and sent back to England.
Right.
I met up with a lot of prisoners during the war. We had a situation where one of our sergeants, we took to some prisoners, some SS prisoners, and they were sent back down the line. And they had a sergeant and a private taking them back they had to go to a seminary. And they met an infantry unit coming up. And the infantry, the officer said, where are you taking them? He said, got to go. He said, they're SS. They said, they ought to be shot, you see. And the sergeant apparently had to take his pistol out and hold the officer to
right.
He's our prisoner. If you want prisoners, you go and get him. Mm-hmm. And actually, they were never more thankful without knowing it.
Of course.
That they were the infantry. But the follow-up infantry and the base were far crueler than the frontline troops. I wouldn't have liked to have been in the hands of as a prisoner with the back troops, with the
just what was going
on. But I remember when some Canadians apparently landed further down, somebody threw a grenade amongst the prisoners in one of the other things. And there was a hell of a stink about that from blokes who were already on the beach.
Yeah.
But they're saying, if you want to kill them, you go and kill them when they're firing guns at you,
Yeah.
And all that sort of thing. And that's it. Well, yes, I saw a lot of prisoners, but on that sense, you saw you went down areas where, luckily, we had air support. We had the Typhoons, and we had artillery. And I remember going down one place down one road where a convoy had been shelled and machine guns and bombed. And there were bodies all over the place, stank of death. You never forget the smell. And there was a corpse here and there were legs here and all that sort of thing.
You said earlier that you had to collect, was it your job to collect the dead from the beach?
Yes, I made a fatal mistake.
Right.
We had, of course, the tide had been in a couple of times and covered some boats with sand, but you knew their hands were out and everything. And the tanks had come in and gone over them anyway. But I made a mistake of getting hold of the hand and pulling to get him out of the sand, and the arm just came straight off like a piece of white meat.
Wow.
Just like that. Oh. So in the end, you finished up by grabbing the uniform and pulling the coat and all the uniform. And we pulled them out. We had to drag them out of the water. They'd been pulled out. And I remember I was saying, bugger this for a game. And I remember our company commander coming up and saying, if you were dead, wouldn't your mother and father want to know where you were?
Yeah.
And then it's funny because before the parachute battalion, before we came back to England, I was with a party they didn't know it, but a party of blokes who went there, and there was a party of them were pattern bombed by the Americans, and they didn't get out of the area quick enough.
Right.
And the Germans had apparently found them and thrown them into a shell hole or something. And we had the job of digging all these bodies out. There were 6 of them, and including the dog. The dog had parachuted with them. And as you got these bodies out, they'd been buried then they were rotting, you see. And we had the padre with us giving us cigarettes, and you had this stink was it, and you had 2 sticks, and you got a body there, and you had to get these sticks into the chest because I sold my discs, but you had to get the string out, and they'd get the discs out, and as they got the disc, they cut one off, and took the disc and recorded his name and number, and then they found the dog, and we took the dog out, and found him, and then they were reburied somewhere else after that. But that was a stinking job, that was, because they'd been in this bloody trench for about 2 months. And but that was the case. We're still recording.
Yeah.
You got to a stage where if American planes came over, you took cover. If the German planes came over, you said, "Oh, well, they're German."
Yeah.
And you had to watch for it. Right. The German pattern bombing was chaotic in the early days, because from what I was told, I don't know if it's true, but they only had one navigator in the first bomber, and then as the whole group were going over, he said go, or pressed his button, and then they all pressed it, and all the planes dropped their bombs at the same time. But these blokes were caught in one of the bombing raids. I think their battalion was warned about it, and they didn't get out quick enough.
Right.
Yeah.